It's easy to picture a public execution as a grim affair, a gray, silent crowd watching a hooded man on a wooden platform. But that picture is mostly wrong. For much of history, an execution was a major public event. It was loud, crowded, and for many it was a day out. Imagine London in the 18th century. Today is an execution day. You would know it was coming, the date was announced well in advance. People from surrounding villages would plan their trip into the city. It was a holiday of sorts. Work would stop. Apprentices were given the day off. Families packed lunches. The atmosphere in the streets was not one of quiet dread. It was more like a fair or a market day. The roads leading to the execution site, like Tyburn, were packed with people. Vendors pushed through the crowd selling everything from pies and gin to souvenir pamphlets. These pamphlets, called broadsides, were big business. They told the life story of the condemned, detailed their crimes, and often included their supposed final confession. People bought them, read them aloud, and saved them. It was the true crime entertainment of its day. The crowd itself was a mix of everyone. You'd see wealthy people who paid for seats in windows or on specially built stands. These were the box seats. They offered a good view and kept you out of the mud and the crush of the common folk. And down below was the main crowd. It was a sea of people, laborers, shopkeepers, servants, soldiers, women, and children. They were all there, pressed together, craning their necks for a better view. The event didn't just start at the gallows. It started with a procession. The condemned would be brought from the prison, often in an open cart. This journey through the city was part of the ritual. It was a parade. The crowd would line the streets. They would cheer, jeer, or sometimes throw things. The reaction depended on the criminal. A hated murderer might get rocks and insults. A popular rogue or a political dissident might get flowers and shouts of support. The condemned person was the star of the show. Their behavior was watched closely. Would they be brave? Would they be repentant? Some would drink heavily on the way, trying to numb their fear. Others would pray with a priest who rode alongside them. A few would play to the crowd, smiling and waving like a hero. Their performance mattered. A good death, a brave death, could turn a villain into a folk legend. When the cart finally reached the scaffold, the final act began. The platform was built high so everyone could see. It was theater. The executioner, often a well-known figure himself, would go about his work. The sheriff would read the official sentence. The priest would offer a final prayer. And then came the most important part for many in the crowd, the final speech. The condemned was given a chance to address the public. This was their last moment on earth, and everyone listened. Some would confess their sins and warn others not to follow their path. They would tell the young people in the audience to obey their parents and fear God. Others would protest their innocence to the very end. A few would use the platform to make a political statement. These speeches were powerful. They were the headline act. The broadside printers would be scribbling furiously to get the last dying words into their next edition. Then the execution itself happened. It was often clumsy and brutal, but the crowd watched. They needed to see it. They needed to see justice done, or what was called justice. After it was over, the body might be left hanging for a time as a further warning. Sometimes the family could claim it. Other times it was sent to the surgeons for dissection, a fate many feared more than death itself. The crowd would then slowly break up. They'd talk about what they saw. They'd discuss the crime, the sentence, the person's final words. They'd finish their pies and head home. For them, it was a memorable day. It was a spectacle that was part religious ceremony, part legal judgment, and part public entertainment. And in this strange mix of piety and party, families were a normal part of the scene. The question wasn't whether you should bring your family. The question for many was how to get a good spot. So why did people go? Why would thousands of men, women, and children gather to watch someone die? It's tempting to think it was just bloodlust, a morbid fascination with death. That was certainly part of it. Humans are drawn to drama, and there is no drama more final than death, but to reduce it to simple gore-seeking misses the point. The reasons people attended were complex. They were woven into the very fabric of their society. First and foremost, the execution was an act of state power. It was the ultimate demonstration of the law. In a time before widespread literacy, police forces, or mass media, justice had to be seen to be believed. A sentence carried out behind closed doors would have been suspect. It would have felt like a secret murder by the authorities. For the law to be real, its consequences had to be public. The execution was a message from the king or the government. The message was simple. This is what happens when you break our rules. The scaffold was a stage where the state performed its authority. The body of the condemned was the billboard. The more terrible the crime, the more elaborate the execution. A simple hanging for a thief, a brutal drawing and quartering for a traitor. Each punishment was designed to communicate a specific level of threat to the social order. The crowd wasn't just watching a person die, they were being reminded who was in charge. Their presence was part of the event. By watching, they were participating in the act of justice. They were witnesses for the state. Then there was the religious element. In a deeply religious era, an execution was not just about the body. It was about the soul. The time between sentencing and execution was a crucial period for repentance. The public display was seen as the final chance for the sinner to make peace with God. The crowd wasn't just there to see a hanging, they were there to see a soul's final battle. A priest or minister would be a central figure in the drama. He would pray with the condemned, urge them to confess, and offer the hope of salvation. The final speech was often a religious one. The condemned would admit their guilt, ask for God's forgiveness, and warn the crowd against temptation. This was considered a good death. It was seen as an inspiring moral lesson for everyone watching. The community could see that even the worst sinner could find grace at the end. It reaffirmed their shared faith. The execution became a public morality play, a sermon written in blood. The community also had its own stake in the event. Executions were often for crimes that directly affected the common person, like theft, robbery, or murder. The punishment was a restoration of order. It was a way for the community to feel that a wrong had been righted. Their world had been disrupted by the crime, and the execution put it back into balance. The crowd's reaction was a vital part of this. Their cheers for the executioner or their jeers for the condemned were a form of public consensus. It was the community saying, "We agree with this. This is justice." But the crowd was not a mindless mob. They could be selective. If they believed a person was innocent or the punishment was too harsh for the crime, they might show sympathy. They might riot and try to free the prisoner. This was a risk the authorities took. The public execution was a dialogue, and sometimes the crowd's voice was louder than the state's. And yes, there was the entertainment. We cannot ignore it. In a world with few distractions, an execution was a major event. It was a spectacle. It was a story with a beginning, a middle, and a very definite end. It had heroes and villains, suspense and resolution. People followed the stories of famous criminals the way we follow characters in a TV series. They knew their histories, their crimes, their courtroom trials. The execution was the final episode. This combination of state power, religious ritual, community justice, and raw entertainment created a powerful social event. It fulfilled a number of needs all at once. It wasn't just one thing, it was many things. And that is why so many people went. They went to be warned, to be taught, to be assured, and to be entertained. They went because in their world it was an important and necessary thing to do. It was a pillar of their social and moral universe. Did parents really bring their children to see a man hang? The answer is yes, they absolutely did. And they didn't do it because they were monsters. They did it because they believed it was part of a good upbringing. It was a lesson, maybe the most important lesson a child could learn. To understand this, we have to step out of our modern mindset about childhood. Today, we see childhood as a special time of innocence that must be protected. We shield our children from the harsh realities of the world, especially death. But in the 17th or 18th century, this idea did not exist. Childhood was seen simply as a training period for adulthood, and life was hard. Death was not a distant, sanitized event. It was everywhere. People died at home. Infant mortality was incredibly high. Families were used to seeing death up close. A public execution was not necessarily the first dead body a child had ever seen. The world was full of casual brutality and suffering that we can barely imagine. The idea of shielding a child from the sight of a hanging would have seemed strange. Life itself was harsh. Why would a lesson about the consequences of crime be any different? So a father might take his son to the gallows not for a thrill, but for an education. It was a practical, vivid demonstration of right and wrong. He could point to the man on the scaffold and say, "See that? That is what happens when you steal." Or, "That is what happens when you disobey the law and turn from God." It was a lesson that would stick. 1,000 sermons in a church could not match the impact of seeing the rope, the trapdoor, and the final twitching of a body. This was often the explicit purpose. Apprentices were taken by their masters. School children were sometimes led in groups by their teachers. The goal was to instill the fear of God and the law into young hearts. It was believed that this fear would keep them on the straight and narrow path. The execution was a tool of social control that began in childhood. The final words of the condemned were often aimed directly at the young people in the crowd. It was a common trope. The dying man would confess his downfall began with small sins in his youth. It started when I stole an apple, he might say. Then I started skipping church. Then I fell in with a bad crowd. He would warn the children to obey their parents, honor the Sabbath, and avoid the temptations of drinking and gambling. For a parent in the crowd, this was a powerful moment. It was an expert witness, a man who had walked the path of sin to its end, confirming everything they had tried to teach their child. This wasn't seen as traumatizing. It was seen as strengthening. It was meant to build a child's moral character. Just as they needed to be prepared for the reality of hard work and disease, they needed to be prepared for the reality of sin and punishment. Seeing an execution was part of learning how the world worked. Of course, children were not just passive observers. They were part of the festive atmosphere. They might eat the same snacks and feel the same excitement as the adults. The event could be confusing, a mix of a holiday outing and a terrifying spectacle. But the central message was clear. It was a shared community experience, and children were part of that community. Excluding them would have been like not taking them to church. It was a vital part of their social and moral education. We have letters and diaries from the period that confirm this. People write about being taken to executions as children and remember the experience vividly. They don't write about it as an act of abuse. They write about it as a significant event, a serious lesson. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded going to see executions and even took his wife. It was a normal part of life. The logic was simple and stark. The world is a dangerous place full of temptation. The price of giving in to that temptation is death and damnation. A child who learns this lesson early, even in a brutal way, has a better chance of surviving and saving their soul. A parent's duty was not to protect their child from the truth, but to show it to them in a way they would never forget. The gallows was a classroom, and the hanging man was the teacher. For centuries, the public execution was a cornerstone of justice in Europe and America. It was a ritual to state, and the people understood. But then, things began to change. The same crowds that had once reliably reinforced the state's message started to become a problem. The spectacle began to slip from the authorities' control. The decline of public executions was not a single event. It was a slow process driven by new ideas and changing social conditions. One of the biggest factors was that the crowd's reaction became unpredictable. The state wanted the crowd to see the execution as a solemn act of justice, but people didn't always play their part. Sometimes the crowd would sympathize with the condemned. This was especially true if the crime was a minor one, like stealing bread to feed a family. England's Bloody Code in the 18th century made hundreds of offenses punishable by death. When people saw a young boy being hanged for pickpocketing, they didn't always see justice. They saw cruelty. They might see the condemned not as a monster, but as a victim of a harsh system. Instead of jeering, they might cheer for the prisoner and hiss at the executioner. Popular criminals like dashing highwaymen or rebels could become folk heroes. Their executions were not seen as a warning, but as a tragedy. The crowd might try to rescue the prisoner from the cart or cause a riot at the gallows. When this happened, the entire purpose of the execution was undermined. Instead of demonstrating the state's power, it exposed its limits. The spectacle turned against its creators. The atmosphere also became a problem. The authorities wanted a grim and orderly lesson. What they often got was a drunken, chaotic carnival. The Tyburn Fair in London was notorious. It was a huge, unmanageable party. Gin was sold freely. Pickpockets and prostitutes worked the crowd. Fights broke out. The solemnity of the event was completely lost. It became clear to many observers that the crowd was not there to learn a moral lesson. They were there for a good time. The fact that pickpockets were busiest at the hangings of other pickpockets was a famous irony. The spectacle of deterrence was clearly not working. At the same time, new ideas were spreading among the educated classes. The Enlightenment brought with it a new way of thinking about humanity, government, and punishment. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy argued that punishments should be rational and proportionate to the crime. He argued that the certainty of punishment, not its severity, was the real deterrent. Cruel public spectacles, he wrote, were a form of barbarism. They hardened society rather than improving it. These ideas about humanity and dignity began to take hold. A growing middle class started to find the public execution distasteful. It was messy, emotional, and vulgar. They began to see it as something for the lower classes. A sense of shame started to attach itself to the practice. Refined people should not be enjoying such brutal displays. The rise of the press also played a crucial role. In the past, you had to be at the execution to experience it. But by the 19th century, newspapers were cheap and widely available. They could report on the crime, the trial, and the execution in graphic detail. People could get their fill of the morbid drama from the comfort of their own homes. The spectacle was no longer tied to a physical place. You could read about it instead of standing in the mud. This privatized the experience and reduced the need for a public display. Finally, the authorities themselves decided they had lost control. The risks of the event, the riots, the sympathy, the carnival atmosphere, outweighed the benefits. The message was getting lost in the noise. They needed a more reliable, more professional way to handle justice. The solution was to move executions behind prison walls. The first private execution in Britain was in 1868. This was a massive change. Justice was no longer a public performance. It became a private, bureaucratic procedure carried out by state officials in a closed room. The public was now excluded. Their role as witnesses was over. The state no longer needed their participation. It had police forces, courts, and prisons to enforce its power. The era of the gallows as public theater had come to an end. It was a quiet revolution, but it marked a profound shift in how society viewed justice, punishment, and itself. Public executions are a thing of the past in most of the world. The gallows has been dismantled. The town square is now a place for farmers' markets, not hangings. We look back on our ancestors who treated execution as a family day out, and we feel a sense of distance. We see their world as brutal, superstitious, and thankfully gone. We believe we are more civilized, more humane. But are we really so different? The ancient ritual of the public execution served several deep human needs. It satisfied a need to see justice done. It provided a stark lesson in morality. It allowed the community to confront transgression and restore a sense of order. And it fed a powerful curiosity about the dark side of human nature. Those needs have not disappeared. The spectacle has not vanished. It has just changed its form. Think about the modern obsession with true crime. It is a massive industry. Podcasts, documentary series, books, and websites are all dedicated to telling the stories of real crimes in minute detail. Millions of people consume these stories eagerly. We follow the case, we learn about the victims, we try to understand the killer's mind, and we wait for the final verdict. We are fascinated by the same elements that drew the crowd to the gallows: the story of a crime, the hunt for the culprit, and the final act of justice. The key difference is that we experience it through headphones and screens. It is a private spectacle, a digital scaffold. High-profile court cases become national events. When a famous person is on trial, the news covers it 24/7. We watch the live feed from the courtroom, we debate the evidence with friends and strangers online. We choose sides, we await the jury's decision like the finale of a TV show. The courtroom becomes a theater, and we are the audience. We are participating in the drama of justice, just as the crowd at Tyburn did. We are witnesses, just from a greater distance. The internet has created a new kind of public square, and it has its own forms of public punishment. When someone is canceled online, a digital mob can form in minutes. Their crime, real or perceived, is broadcast to the world. People gather to condemn, to shame, and to demand punishment, often in the form of losing a job or being deplatformed. This is not a physical death, but it can be a kind of social death. The impulse to gather as a crowd to identify a transgressor and to cast them out is the same. The platform is just different. We can even find echoes of the old spectacle in the way we consume images of real violence. The internet makes it possible to see things that were once hidden. Graphic videos of accidents, acts of war, or police brutality can spread across the world in an instant. We know we shouldn't watch, but many do. That old morbid curiosity is still there. We are drawn to the raw, unfiltered reality of life and death, even if it horrifies us. We are still peering at the scaffold, but now it fits in the palm of our hand. We have not evolved beyond the impulses that drove our ancestors. We have just found new, cleaner, more technologically advanced ways to satisfy them. We have replaced the public execution with the televised trial, the true crime podcast, and the viral video. We get to experience the thrill of the spectacle without the smell of the crowd or the sight of real blood. We can feel the moral satisfaction of seeing a villain brought to justice without having to leave our living rooms. Perhaps this is a form of progress. It is certainly less brutal. But it's worth remembering that the human heart that was beating in the chest of a man watching a hanging in 1750 is not so different from the one beating in our own. The need to see, to judge, and to understand the breaking of rules is a fundamental part of us. The scaffold is gone, but the spectacle endures.